Hello everybody and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 12 years now. I currently sit in our knowledge and practice part of the organisation, and my role is to look at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 110,000 members working worldwide right across that property lifecycle through land, planning and development, construction, finance, valuation, brokerage, building surveying, building management, asset management. It's a very wide canvas upon which the power of data and technology is having a profound effect. And indeed, our members also work across all the main asset types of land itself, residential, commercial, alternative and infrastructure. And I'm really glad to have Dominic join me from Darabase today. So welcome, Dominic.
Hi, well, thank you for having me, Andrew. Much appreciated.
Pleasure. Before we get into the bits and bytes and hear what Darabase is doing, it's always great to have a bit of a backstory about you and the origin story of Darabase itself.
Yeah, sure. So I've been basically in kind of media and digital and kind of, I suppose, transformational roles for some time. So way back when, back in the 90s, I used to work in magazines. So on Esquire magazine and worked on Cosmopolitan magazine and so on, when people still bought magazines. And then kind of the digital kind of revolution happened, and I kind of got quite interested in that, and ended up joining an Italian startup called Buongiorno, and then from there I ran digital at Sky, did the digital transformation of Auto Trader when Apex, the private equity company, bought half of that business. Then ran a couple of digital companies for Orange, France Telecom. At the time, they were doing the joint venture with Deutsche Telekom, which became EE. So I ran their global advertising business and what was called Orange Digital. And then I moved into the joint venture to help launch the EE brand and ran the digital P&L of EE, Orange, and T-Mobile. From there, I then moved to Legal & General and was the group chief marketing officer for a period of time there. And then I kind of felt on a personal level, it might, whilst I've spent most of my career helping large companies be more digital, it might be more fun to help digital companies be more large, kind of get that little pivot there. So I then, I was actually out in Silicon Valley with WPP. I was a client of WPP, and they do this thing called the West Coast Tour, where they take around kind of 12, 15 CMOs to meet kind of the great and the good of Silicon Valley. And while I was there, I met Jack Dorsey at Twitter or X as it's now called, and a number of others. Really interesting week. And the last company that I saw there was a company called Jaunt, which is a virtual reality and then augmented reality company that we ended up selling to Verizon. And I kind of then joined that organization to help them kind of expand internationally. Did a JV in China. Also ended up running products and engineering in the States as well. And it was really while I was there that I kind of had this kernel of an idea that became Darabase. And so Darabase is essentially an AR database. That's kind of where the name comes from at its most simplistic level. And it was really kind of in the knowledge that, I believe, many believe, that increasingly our digital lives are shifting from kind of two-dimensional flat screens to a more spatial, a more immersive web. And today that's mostly on mobile, where you're kind of seeing digital content layered on the physical world through the camera of your phone. But in the not too distant future, there's billions of dollars of investment being put into this by all the major, a lot of the major tech companies. That will be through some kind of wearable device. And so, I suppose Darabase really was born out of this thought that if an increasing amount of our digital lives is going to be layered on the canvas that is the physical world, that the physical world needs to have a say in that they need to be able to control and monetize it. And so Darabase really exists to be able to make that true.
Indeed. And as you said, that kind of augmented reality is arguably already a big opportunity. And as ever, we quickly descend into jargon, but we've now got this augmented OOH, this out-of-home advertising. Is that the future of advertising, do you think?
I think it's going to be a massive transition. I mean, what always happens with advertising and content more generally is that as an audience shifts and as the eyeball shifts, kind of the dollars follow. So, think back to the magazines. Magazines was a huge industry in terms of advertising. Still exists, but it's far smaller than it was today because fewer people read magazines. Equally, digital advertising is, this year will be around $680 billion. So 2/3 of $1 trillion will be spent on advertising digitally. And that didn't really exist, 15, 20 years ago. And so, that's not new money. That's money that has shifted from other media, whether it be TV or whatever. And what's interesting is that actually out-of-home advertising, so billboards, screens, etc., is the only traditional advertising medium that's still kind of stable or slightly growing. And it's worth around $47 billion a year. So not insignificant, but actually augmented reality advertising is already a tenth of that. It's already $4.4 billion a year. And we're seeing that growing incredibly quickly. So is it, I believe that augmented reality is a massive part of the future media mix. It won't replace everything, but as we spend more and more time, experiencing content in this way, especially when we get to wearable devices. But even today, Pokemon Go still makes around $2 billion a year, I believe. So that's not gone anywhere. Yes, this will be an increasingly important part of how brands want to reach an audience and how audiences engage with digital content that hopefully makes their lives easier.
And as you said, Dominic, that this is, in one respect, we're talking about kind of the cyber world, but actually this is overlaid, as you said, on a canvas, which is physical property. So why is it important that asset owners, property owners actually register their properties in some way as part of that physical canvas that this is going to be set on top of?
Yeah, so we've kind of encapsulated that thought into what we call property digital rights. So in the same way that a lot of assets already create incremental asset value from other types of opportunity, it could be mineral rights, it could be air rights. Equally, it could just be outdoor media. So for example, Piccadilly Lights in London, the large screen which is owned by Landsec, on Landsec's balance sheet is worth over £200 million. So that's just the screen, right? But not the building behind it. But that's because it makes a certain amount of money per year. That a yield is applied to that revenue, and then that creates an asset value. And so we believe that there is this new asset class. There's this new opportunity which is significant, which is property digital rights. So this is the opportunity, and Darabase facilitates this for property companies with very low cost, if any cost, certainly no capital cost, to be able to register their properties on Darabase, register the associated, mint the associated property digital rights, and then we have an algorithm that then estimates based on the location and a bunch of other data what the likely revenue is over time in terms of what could be made in these different types of locations and different types of properties from advertising revenue, and then we use a similar model to then apply yield and upweight that to an asset value. And we think that as a headline number, that anywhere up to around 2% of the physical asset value can be uplifted in terms of property digital rights. So if you've got a £100 million building, that there's an opportunity to increase that by an additional £2 million in terms of asset value based on these new rights.
So I mean, if somebody was kind of skeptical and thought, well, can't be bothered, don't see the need. I mean, is there a downside to not registering, given that this new kind of right is being created, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, it is a nascent industry, and there are lots of ways that people are going about, placing content on the physical world. What is clear, though, is that from a regulatory and kind of legal perspective, the same laws and regulations that apply to all the advertising that we have today also applies to this new type of advertising content. And so, you do need the permission of the property owner to be able to place certainly commercial content in their location and on their building. Now, Darabase makes it very simple to be able to register and say what you want to happen on your building. And so that's essentially one of three things. You can either say, well, look, I don't want any content on my building. So just, for anyone who's making a call against Darabase, please ensure that no content then is viewed. So it could be a hospital, it could be the Houses of Parliament, whatever it is. This is just, this is a risk mitigation play for me, certainly in the first instance. Secondly, you could then say, well, actually, I see this as an opportunity. Whilst maybe even from a planning perspective, I couldn't put a big screen on the outside of my building, I can allow augmented reality content to appear there to the increasing numbers of people who are walking past, using one of these experiences. And so I will allow advertising, almost like a kind of a passive revenue opportunity over time. And actually, we allow you to kind of deselect certain types of categories of advertising. So maybe you've got a Starbucks downstairs. So you think, oh, I don't want any kind of competing content from there, or I don't want any alcohol, and there's certain things obviously we just don't allow anyway. Or the third thing, and this is kind of coming soon, is actually you might want to be able to serve your own content. And so to those same people walking past, playing a game in the tourism app, retail, whatever it may be, these applications that Darabase is plugged into to help them to monetize their audience, there's an opportunity also to serve your own content. So, so maybe you're a museum and think, well, I don't want to serve any advertising on my museum, but if someone's walking past the museum, I might like to say, hey, there's a new dinosaur exhibition, and use that to drive footfall in a very powerful way, because it's leveraging the location, the context of that location, the fact that somebody's right outside. And so there's really no downside from a property company perspective. We're about to launch the Darabase.io platform. Actually, at the time that we're recording this, it launches tomorrow, and so by the time this comes out, it will have already launched. And actually, the first 1,000 properties are free to register. After that, at the moment, it's only $49 anyway to register. So this isn't some kind of cost implication, and actually it helps you to draw a line in the sand. So if somebody is putting content illegally on your building, you can say, look, I've registered on Darabase, I've facilitated how you can serve content, and actually it's far more powerful from a kind of cease and desist perspective to be able to kind of take steps to stop that content appearing. We actually have working with RPC, a whole white paper on kind of the whole regulatory and legal perspective. So again, you can find that on our website. But there's quite a kind of good underpinning in terms of kind of the legal position for this.
Indeed, and from a kind of, as you say, from that kind of initial cost perspective, it feels like it's similar to, even if you don't want to particularly leverage it and get into more kind of, I guess, costs around actually, putting advertising up and getting more involved, one could at least reserve it in the same way you perhaps in the 90s and noughties reserved your web domain and made sure that actually that was protected before you perhaps invested in a full website. So
yeah, I think that's a great analogy. Plus also we kind of, it's that plus we do the website for you. So so actually all you need to do is register, and if you allow advertising, that's it. You just hopefully receive a check, simplistically, because actually what we do is then we create the inventory in that location, and then in real time, as people are walking past, we will then basically recognize where the inventory is. We will understand the rules around that inventory, and then we plug into existing ad exchanges, whether they be mobile, digital, or even actually out of home, because increasingly out of home advertising is being bought programmatically, and then in real time we will then serve the right advertising for that location to that user. And so beyond registering rather and kind of setting out what you want to happen in your location, there's really very little to do.
Indeed. So as you say, you probably see it in the future turning into this kind of, as people are used to in terms of media buying, this kind of ad serve type mentality where people are just buying this stuff very dynamically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it's really this kind of the merging of all of the benefits of digital and all of the benefits of out of home that makes it outdoor kind of augmented reality so exciting. But what's interesting is that from a digital perspective, there's really only two parties. You've got an advertiser and you've got a publisher or an app or a website, and there's huge amounts of complexity of pipes that kind of connect those two things. I think as an industry, we made it incredibly complicated, but that's basically what's going on. And then from an outdoor media perspective, you've basically got a property company and an advertiser. And I suppose what we're doing is we're blending those two things together. So there's now three parties. You have an advertiser, you have an application or a website, but then what Darabase does is facilitates the property as part of that transaction. And so we ensure that when advertising is placed, that revenue is going to the property company as well as then to the publisher from the brand.
Indeed. I guess the obvious question from the potential skeptic out there would be, you're really kind of understanding, almost get the origin of this concept of a property digital rights, and once you have that, it's enforceability in law, its status within England and Wales law, internationally, and given obviously an asset manager who might be thinking about multiple properties in multiple jurisdictions, could you talk us through almost the fundamental concept of this and its place within the more traditional property rights sector in terms of people understanding the concept of landlord and tenant and all those kind of different things around the world in terms of property rights?
Absolutely. So I think there's some stuff that's incredibly clear, and then there's some stuff that absolutely needs to get worked out. So let's because this is a pretty new phenomenon, and as an industry, there's some things that need to kind of need to get considered. So what's incredibly clear is that the same regulations that apply to advertising applies to this. There was no concept of, when outdoor media went from paper billboards to digital screens, that it was like, oh, well, the advertising regulations don't exist anymore because we only thought about paper billboards. Well, of course, it just now applies to digital screens, and it also now applies to augmented reality advertising, because it just talks about commercial messages in physical locations. The second thing then is that there's also a bunch of law, such as like the Lanham Act in the US, passing off an implied endorsement law in the UK, which tends to be kind of housed inside of copyright and IP law, which basically is where you're creating some kind of implied endorsement between a location or an asset and a brand. And so, if you put a Coca-Cola ad on the top of Manchester United, Old Trafford, in AR, and actually there's no relationship, don't know whether there is or not, but there's no relationship, let's say, between Coca-Cola and Old Trafford, there's an implied endorsement that there's some kind of sponsorship opportunity, and that the location that is Old Trafford, it has in some way kind of endorsed Coca-Cola. And if that doesn't happen, it's essentially illegal. That's kind of the first thing. The second thing then is that that actually the platforms themselves also only allow permission-based media. So if you look at, for example, Snapchat has a tool called landmarkers, where they allow, through their kind of Lens Studio platform, brands and content companies to be able to create AR experiences on landmark properties around the world. And very clearly it says on their website, landmarker templates are not offered for commercial use, essentially, unless you have the permission of the property company. So what we also then find, and Google and Meta and others have the same approach, that you've got all these platforms making it ever, and developer tools and so on, make it ever more easy for these types of experiences to be created. But those same platforms also need to, ask you to ensure that you have the right permissions to be able to then publish on that platform to their audience. That's the second thing. Now, so permission is absolutely required. There's no advertising in this world that doesn't have permission, so it isn't illegal. Simplicity. So that's kind of a little bit put to bed. Now, what's a little bit hazier? What's a little bit less clear? What do we need to work out as an industry? Why might RICS even be able to help? It is that actually. So who is it, and what contracts already exist that determines, who owns ultimately these rights? Is it the ground owner? Is it the freehold owner? Should a tenant have that as part of their contract? Should management companies be able to register, Cushman & Wakefield or CBRE, be able to register this on behalf of their clients? And so there is no law, there's no precedent right now that says, okay, property digital rights 100% are owned by this, this part of the value chain. The way that we get around that is that because it is, it could be that, if we look at outdoor media today, it's not dissimilar. There will be some outdoor media deals that JCDecaux does where they're dealing directly with the council. It could be where they're dealing with, a broker whose sole role is to make, is to help property companies deal with outdoor media. It could be that they're dealing with, with Landsec directly, whatever. So what we as Darabase do is say, that you warrant to us that you have the permission to be able to register these rights and to manage these rights on behalf of all parties. We also do some kind of verification in the background. So if John Biggins from somewhere random says that they own Buckingham Palace, we kind of go, well, that doesn't smell right. So there's some checks that's going on in the background as well. But so I think that what we'll start to see as property digital rights become a more kind of mature asset class is that some of these things will start to be written into the internal contracts. So, as a tenant, you might have deferred rights to be able to manage your bit of the building in terms of how that canvas is used, etc. Because it's kind of like a window display. And so, so there's probably precedent in terms of how it works physically that can then be applied to the digital world.
Indeed. And you alluded quite early in the conversation, Dominic, obviously about the potential effect on value for property, and obviously that ties into some extent in terms of who those rights accrue to in terms of income and things like that. But how do you see it kind of affecting property valuation? And I guess putting my kind of virtual CFO hat on, do PDRs become an asset on the balance sheet? How are these things going to impact literally the commercial real estate world in pounds and pence, to be blunt?
So when you register your property and your property digital rights, we have an algorithm as part of that registration process that basically takes a bunch of kind of fairly standard data, like location, type of property. As we look at kind of the digital maturity from an advertising perspective of that location, because we're launching in 38 countries from launch, and the actual physical asset value of the location, which is kind of held privately, but it kind of gives us an indication whether there's existing outdoor media in the location, etc. All of these things are taken into consideration, and then we create an estimate of what the property digital rights value is, and that is anywhere between kind of 0.25% and up to around 2% of the physical property value. And so if you've got a £100 million building, as I said, that's kind of a £2 million asset value, up to £2 million asset value. Now, two things. One, that is just an estimate, and it's based on how outdoor media revenue is valued today. And in the short term, we think that will probably be a good kind of modus operandi to follow. And so what happens today, I think in the vast majority of cases, is that the revenue from outdoor media is simply kind of added to the asset value, added to the revenue. Maybe a slightly different yield might be applied to it, and then that kind of rolls up into the overall asset value for the property. So it's not the case that there's a separate thing on the balance sheet for outdoor media. It's just an additional kind of leasehold type revenue. We think the same will happen for this. Now, in the fullness of time, if this becomes significant and it becomes more kind of endemic across the entire industry, maybe it is that it matures enough that property digital rights becomes a standalone asset on the register. But that we're certainly a few years away from that.
Yeah, and I guess that probably answers a question I was going to raise about where this intersects with our RICS members and their interests, because I guess on the one hand there's a need here for clarity in lease agreements and license agreements in terms of who gets the value and who is able to assign these rights and share these rights. And I guess from the perspective of our valuers within the profession is understanding that now this probably becomes increasingly another line in their discounted cash flow when they're looking at that kind of approach to value a building, to say, well, actually, these are additional services that the building is effectively receiving income from, in the same way that they do from, if you think of flex workspaces, where they're looking at additional lines of income, and as you say, in terms of traditional outdoor advertising, where if that's a significant portion, that would be built in, as you say, with probably a different yield and different kind of expectations, but it would presumably, from a valuation perspective, now become a part of that discounted cash flow. And increasingly, I think when people are looking at the kind of the lease and rental agreements and licensing and those parts, that they think about this being much more an integral part of those lease agreements.
Yeah, I think so. And to a degree, we'll be led by the industry on how best to do that. And, we work very closely with a lot of our partners and clients are some of the largest property companies in the world, and these are active conversations that we're having. Whether that be in the Middle East or in North America or in the UK and Europe. I think that I think what's slightly different potentially is the potential order of magnitude. So today, outdoor media as an industry is around $47 billion of spend a year. And a lot of that goes back to the property companies because it's on their buildings that the billboards and screens are being placed. The digital advertising is, as I said, $680 billion, so nearly 2/3 of $1 trillion. And as the audience and as the engagement shifts across to this new medium, we expect tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to be shifting across as well. In fact, AR is already worth $4.4 billion today. We're right at the beginning of that curve. So I think firstly that there's kind of the order of magnitude will make this quite a significant opportunity. The second thing then is that, I mean, we often hear the term no-brainer in meetings with property companies because this is nearly all upside. There's really there's no capital cost, to putting up a screen. There's no, luminosity issues. There's no environmental ESG considerations around, digital screens. So actually, this is really all upside and zero risk in terms of registering and seeing how that grows over time. So I think from a property owner's perspective or from a property management perspective, it's unclear how this will necessarily be dealt with either as an individual thing or kind of wrapping up into an overarching value. We certainly have, partners who have views on that, and we're actually going to be launching a white paper with a large North American audit and account company, specifically looking at how property digital rights should be treated. But the size of the opportunity, I think, will bring it into kind of quite sharp focus.
Yeah. I suppose as ever that growth potential, I guess what it does would have to focus people's minds on is obviously the potential reputational risk of getting the right advertisers for your property, and that kind of sense of, I mean, you used the Starbucks example where you wouldn't want either a direct competitor if they were one of your tenants, or something that would jar in some way. So I guess like any kind of maturity here, if people are used to having perhaps a relatively low level of traditional outdoor advertising, they're going to have to understand this step change of the kind of volume that might be involved, which is great in terms of the revenue generation, but being aware of the positioning issues and those reputational issues as well, Dominic.
Yeah, definitely. And so that's why we brought in some of the kind of the categorization options today, which relatively simplistic. I think the other thing to bear in mind though is that because this is inherently digital, everybody could be seeing a different advertisement. So whereas with outdoor media today, which is very broadcast, it's kind of one to many. You put a I don't know, a mobile phone ad on the side of a building, everyone's seeing the mobile phone ad, regardless of whether they're looking for a mobile phone. Whereas obviously within the bounds of the regulation and the law, working with third parties like Google potentially and others in terms of ad targeting. Actually, you and I could see something entirely different on the side of a building. So I think one, that makes the advertising more powerful, but to a degree, from a property owner's perspective, it mitigates some of the risk because it kind of almost blurs a little bit kind of what's being seen on the side of the building, and it also makes it more relevant to the user as well.
Indeed. Well, fascinating. And as you mentioned, you're very soon to launch. So by the time this discussion is published, that will have happened. So for today, Dominic, thanks very much. But I really would value catching up again, not too distant future, to see how it's going. So,
yeah, no, I think one last thing just to mention, Andrew, as well, is that as part of the platform, we're also launching a marketplace. So, so from a property digital rights perspective, we expect many property companies just to retain all of those rights and therefore receive all of the revenue. But actually, there is an opportunity to kind of fractionalize and tokenize those rights. And so it could be that you decide, actually, I'm going to put 10% of the rights in the marketplace, and then others can then bid on those and purchase those. What that means for you as the property owner is, one, immediate revenue, because people will be going, actually, I think I'm really interested in that location. I can see how that could go up in value and create revenue over time. And actually, what you're selling essentially is a 10-year lease to those rights. So if you sell 10% of your rights in the marketplace, you will receive immediate revenue for those rights, and then you will receive 90% of the revenue thereafter. But in 10 years' time, those rights will revert back to you as the property digital title holder. But what it also does, it gives you a kind of a ready reckoner in terms of the value of those rights, because then you've got the rights, a small percentage of the rights being traded and retraded in the marketplace. And so actually, from an audit and kind of valuation perspective, not only can we be looking at kind of the likely revenue opportunity, but also in terms of what those actual assets are being traded, how they're being traded in the marketplace. Which and those two things together, I think, will maybe slightly change how this particular asset class gets valued in the future.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important point, because you say if you've got that primary market evidence of that secondary market where you can sell those fractional assets, as you say, it gives a valuer a very strong price discovery comparable to understand that. So that that's an interesting point as well. So, well, I say, fascinating area, and as you say, an area where advertising is going to continue to grow and potentially a step change. So let's keep talking.
Brilliant. Well, look, Andrew, thank you so much for having me on the podcast, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Pleasure.